Welcome everyone to our webinar called Building Resilience at Scale in conversation with Seattle Children's Research Institute. My name is Matthew Jordan. I'm one of the executive creative directors at Artefact. This webinar is part of our Impact by Design series. So if you're interested in attending more events, either virtually or in person someday, please sign up at the link in the chat that you can see below. So Artefact, just a little bit of intro about Artefact before we introduce our guests to have our conversation. Artefact is a strategy and design firm based in Seattle. And what we do is we help companies plan for the future and also create the products and experiences that get them there. We do this through a lens of what we call responsible design, which means that we're not only designing for the community of use, but we're also thinking about positive impact across broad stakeholder groups, for society overall, and even for the world in which we live. So that's me. I think what we can do now is pop in. Abby and Joyce, do you guys want to come on and say hello? So this is our panelists. Hi, yeah. So we have Abby, Dr. Abby Rosenberg, and also Dr. Joyce Frazier. Do you guys just want to give a quick little introduction about yourself and also what you do at Seattle Children's Research Institute?
Sure, I'll go first. Hi, everybody. Welcome. Thank you for being here. My name is Abby Rosenberg. I'm a kids cancer doctor and palliative care researcher by training. And what I do is part of my life is involved in taking care of young people with cancer, mostly teens and young adults. And then the most of my job is doing research to figure out how to promote good quality of life, alleviate suffering, and build resilience in kids and families who are facing serious illness.
Awesome. Joyce?
Hi, everyone. I'm Joyce Frazier. I am Abby's partner in this work on resilience and Prism specifically. I am a research psychologist and an investigator at Seattle Children's, where I've been for over 10 years now. And I've really enjoyed this partnership with Artefact as we've got to build our digital app.
Awesome. Thank you both for taking the time to chat. As always, it's great to see you both. I think what I'd like to do before we get into the experience of the Prism journey is to just talk a little bit so the audience knows why we're here today, and then also talk about sort of how we're going to structure the webinar itself. So the reason that we're here is just we want to share our experience collaborating on Prism and sort of how we've been positioning it for scale so that others in the world who are doing similar things would be able to leverage our learnings in the work that they're doing. So that's sort of the first reason. The second reason we're here is that we do want to reflect on some of the larger context in the world that's going on right now so that we can sort of shine a spotlight on the importance of being resilient. And then the third reason why we're here is that we also just want to sort of continue to engage with the community, the audience, through discussion so that we can continue to advance how people from the design side and people from the clinical side and the research side are collaborating together to, again, create these solutions that help people achieve better health outcomes and also better healthcare experiences. So the way we'll structure our time is Abby is going to talk us through the origin story of Prism. Then we'll dive in deep and sort of show what the app experience itself is. We'll then sort of expand back out and think about the innovations, how to get interventions like this at scale and sort of what resilience means in our time and also potentially in the future. And then sort of throughout we'll be talking about some of the lessons that we've learned as a sort of collaborative team. So we do want to leave about 15 minutes at the end of the webinar so that the audience can ask questions and we can have a dialogue with them. So as we're talking about the journey of Prism, please feel free to add questions in the Q&A function of Zoom. Just go ahead and put them in there. We'll start going through those right as we're sort of wrapping up some of the main talking points that we wanted to go through. So we're going to just try and get to as many questions as we can. We'll also have our contact information at the end, so feel free to always just sort of like follow up with other questions, of course, right? Okay, so first topic is a little bit just sort of about the background. So when I all first met you, when Artefact and sort of the Prism folks came together, what was really struck me, and this is going back 3 years or so, was just sort of the strength of the partnership between you, Abby, and Joyce. Like, it was just, you guys were very sort of in step, very like this great like team. Like, wow, they're just such a unified force. And I'm just curious to hear if you can tell us a little bit more about like how you guys met and sort of what the how the relationship came to be so special.
Yeah, thanks for asking that, Matthew. So just for full disclosure, I didn't realize until early this morning that Joyce was going to be able to join us. So I'm going to embarrass her a little bit because I was going to like wax poetic about how amazing she is. But really, when Joyce and I first met, I was at the beginning of my career as a pediatric oncologist who was interested in resilience, and she was an emerging leader in resilience theory in the psychology realm, working with patients with diabetes. And I will say, sort of jumping to the end, that you're right, Matthew, our symbiotic relationship, I think, has really been critical for our overall success of the program, and we'll talk about that later. But when we first met, we didn't actually like each other very much. We were sort of brought together at this forum for thinking about how we should like make a policy decision about how resilience should be important for patients with cancer. And, you know, I think in retrospect, we were both sort of trying to find our place in the world. And we sat across the table from each other. We were the only people in the room who had any real knowledge about what resilience was and how to study it. And we became two voices in the room who disagreed. And what's really interesting to me is the theories that each of us was trying to champion at the time ended up not where we ended up together. We sort of started at opposite ends and worked closely to come together to figure out how to work together. But that was the beginning. And then about a year after that, we both applied for a grant to fund our early research from Seattle Children's Research Institute. And each of us had proposed this resilience project in our own populations of patients. And the funders looked at these applications and they said, we think it's really interesting that two of you are curious about research. And we don't know if you know each other, but we're going to fund both of you as long as you make friends and figure out how to work together. And so Joyce and I sort of begrudgingly came together. I think neither of us could ever have predicted how like just pivotal our friendship and collaboration would have been in our work together. And Joyce, I can't say enough about how grateful I am that we have been able to do all of this work side by side.
Awesome. Joyce,
Yeah, and I'll just really quickly just say the feeling is absolutely mutual, and we quickly got over our disagreements when we realized, like, oh, she knows what she's talking about. I'm continually impressed with Abby's leadership in this area, and I'm just feel really blessed to be on her team. So
awesome. It was something to me that was very, very striking when we first met. That it was like, wow, they've been working together forever, and they must have had this like joint path throughout. And then I just sort of, you know, dug into the story a little bit more, and I heard that it was a little bit of being forced together, but then it actually did become this like beautiful thing. So it's great that you guys found each other. Let's just say. Okay,
and the take-home message, is like, you know, diversity makes us better. I know that's where we're going at the end of it all, but listening to other ideas and opinions and really thinking outside of the box with folks is part of the reason we've been successful. And Matthew, you guys know that really well at Artefact. You have taught us that too.
Great, awesome. All right, so before we jump in and actually show the Prism app, I think what would be great though is for you guys to tell us a little bit about the science behind the Prism intervention, because it's really one of the things that makes it very, very different from a lot of the other mindfulness resources that are out there. So if you're able to just sort of give us what that overview of the sciences would be great.
Yeah. So I made a few little slides, and Matthew, thank you for sharing them. All right. So when Joyce and I started our work, we were both coming into this really at a time where how people thought about resilience was in fact quite controversial. And I think that's partly why we were coming at it with different eyes and lenses about how to study and measure it. And this is a graph that sort of demonstrates that experience. It's written by one of the preeminent and really leading psychology resilience researchers in the field, a gentleman named George Bonanno, who was studying bereavement. And so what you're looking at here on the vertical axis is distress and depression, and on the horizontal axis is time. And what Dr. Badano was evaluating was folks going through their lives until a traumatic event happens. In this case, it was the death of their spouse, and following that, sort of how they went through their processes of recovery. And what's really interesting to me and to many others about this graph is that I don't know that this was Dr. Bonanno's intention, but it really underscores all of the different ways we all thought about resilience at the time. So for example, on the far left, there are those 3 different lines of people kind of moving through their lives. And there's a line at the top, the sort of line, dot, dot, line group. And there will be folks who would look at this graph and say, resilience is defined over there on the far left by some sort of personal characteristic or trait that people have or they don't have, and it predisposes them to some negative or positive outcome. And so resilience is something defined way before we experience adversities based on something that is already within us. The second school of thought would look at the middle of this graph and say, no, resilience is a process of adapting to whatever is somebody's new normal, and it can be changed. You can change the shape of this graph based on how people are coping and adapting. And then finally, there was a school of thought that said resilience is an outcome. It is defined only at the end or after some period of time after a traumatic event has happened. And it's measurable by the presence or absence of something like chronic grief, meaning you're not resilient, or full recovery to your baseline, which means that you are. Next slide, Matthew. So in the setting of all of this debate, there was this big meeting in Europe in 2013 where they got all these people up on stage and they said, okay, tell us why each of you thinks your theory is the right one. And this is a photograph of a cultural anthropologist named Catherine Panterbrick. She's speaking here in this picture at a different forum, but she was one of the speakers at this meeting. And so, by the way, was Dr. Bonanno, whose graph you just looked at. And what Dr. Bonanno does is what's called ethnographies, and she basically goes and lives in different populations and communities who are going through adversity, and she watches and she asks the questions, what are people doing? How are they doing this? And what she said is, in all of her different observations, resilience is a process of harnessing the resources we need to sustain well-being. It is this thing that human beings do in order to get through adversity. It is not a trait on the far left of the graph. It's not an outcome on the far right. It is sort of defined in the middle, but by particular actions that we human beings can take in order to survive whatever is our new normal. Next slide, Matthew. And then what turns out to be really interesting across all of the different studies is that what those resources are, what people bring to themselves, is almost always consistently falling within these 3 categories of what we call external resilience resources, internal resilience resources, or existential resilience resources. And so what do I mean by that? And these are things that we have now duplicated, we and others have duplicated in many, many, many studies and many, many adversities. So the first thing that human beings may do is bring to themselves external resilience resources like social support community, who helps us when times are hard. The next thing that we do is gather our internal resilience resources. These include those personality and characteristics that may or may not be changeable, things like grit, hardiness, optimism, but they also include the things we learn along the way about how to cope and how to manage the stressors that we're experiencing. And then finally, at the end, are existential resilience resources. And these are the sometimes less tangible, but inherently human questions that we ask, the meaning making, the faith, the sort of, why is this happening to me? What does this mean to me? Who am I going to be because of this? How is this going to impact my family? And all of those considerations that go through our mind, it turns out are really important for defining our resilience. Next slide. So all of that is great, and that felt much more manageable to both me and Joyce as we were doing our research. The challenge, though, is how patients and families experienced their own adversities when we were talking about serious illness was something that we didn't quite understand. And we wanted to better understand from patients and families, like, does this resonate? How would we apply this? If you had to teach to another person like you what you learned along the way, how to be resilient, what do you think is important? And so we did a series of studies trying to answer that question so that we could create a program that would be reproducible and implementable in a large scale. Next slide. And so what this is literally hundreds of interviews with teen and young adult patients where we essentially said, how have you learned to be resilient and why? And these were teens and young adults with cancer who really at the end of the day said, resilience isn't something that you're born with. It isn't something that you either have or you don't have. It's not defined in the future. At any given moment, we all have a capacity to feel more resilient. And the scales can tip towards that resilience or away from it. And they were really consistent in defining what they thought were contributing factors towards tipping the scales towards feeling resilient and inhibiting factors. And the contributing factors were things like managing stress, having coping strategies, having goals and a sense of purpose, so something to look forward to, some sort of intentionality and meaning in their lives, being able to stay positive even in the face of a lot of negativity or worry, being able to find benefit and meaning from their experience, and then also being able to connect with their peers and their family and their loved ones and maintain that sense of normalcy and social support. Next slide. What was interesting to us was when we looked, sorry, Matthew, go back one more. When we thought about what these teens were telling us, these things like managing stress, having goals, staying positive, benefit finding, those contributing factors were things we could teach. And they were things that we could really work one-on-one with patients and families to build up and bolster their resilience resources. And we thought this is something that we can actually operationalize and turn into a program that may be reproducible and helpful. Okay,
and that's the same for the inhibiting factors as well?
Yeah, so
how to navigate them?
Yes, thank you for saying that. So the sort of counterpiece to each of these contributing factors was almost always the exact opposite. Like, if I just get overwhelmed by my stress or I can't turn off my brain because I'm so worried about it, then I don't feel resilient in that moment. And that makes it harder for me to deal with whatever is going to come tomorrow. And so we really wanted to try to tip the scales that way to the left. And so we developed this thing called Prism, which we're going to talk a lot about over the next few minutes. But Prism stands for Promoting Resilience and Stress Management. Next slide. And it is very simple, but it really just listened to what teens and young adults and parents told us about what were their own resilience resources and how could we turn that into a curriculum. So that we target 4 main resilience resource topics, including managing stress, goal setting, positive reframing, and meaning making. And we do this in individual coaching sessions with kids or their families. Managing stress, for example, includes 3 little mini skills. And the first is essentially a deep breathing exercise. So it helps people just calm themselves in a moment that might feel hard. And then the next 2 exercises progressively work on things like mindfulness techniques that Matthew mentioned earlier. The first is taking a step further from that calming of the mind towards a relaxation state so that people can be more receptive to whatever activities they need to do next. And the third activity is a mindfulness meditation that helps people become aware of their stressors without judging them. So sort of acknowledging, oh, that's the thing that's really freaking me out right now. And I realize that I'm freaked out about it, but it's going to be something I handle later. The next thing we do is a goal setting session, and specifically we help people to think about setting specific, measurable, specific, measurable, actionable, realistic, and time-dependent or SMART goals. And what SMART goals are things that people can actually achieve and maintain some forward momentum and see that forward momentum. We work with them to think about what's going to happen when you get derailed from this goal and normalize those roadblocks as people go along their journeys so that we can continue to help them with their forward-looking thoughts. Then we do something called positive reframing. This is really 2 mini skills. The first is like recognizing all of that destructive negative talk that swirls around in our heads and maybe wakes us up in the middle of the night or keeps us up at night. And again, sort of acknowledging that those thoughts are there. And then the second part of that is reframing those thoughts into something that is manageable, if not optimistic. So for example, oh my God, I have no friends anymore and nobody likes me, turns into, you know what? I'm missing a lot of my friends and I haven't seen them because I've been sick. And that might feel subtle, but it's still a really important thing that makes something that was previously catastrophic a little bit more tangible and doable. And then the last thing we do is meaning making, which is the final anchor of all of these skills. And this is where we help folks to identify benefits, gratitude, purpose, and legacy. And it can be as simple as, can you think of some good thing that has happened today? Or this has been really hard, but can you think of something that you're grateful for? And so that, oh my gosh, I have no friends, turns into, I have fewer friends than I thought I did, and I miss them. And finally, I realize what real friendship looks like because I'm really grateful for that person who keeps coming to visit me. After all of that, we do something called coming together, which is where the trained coach meets with the patient or the family or whoever is receiving Prism and kind of does a debrief where the Prism recipient, if it's a teen, can teach back to his or her loved ones what worked and how he wants to move forward. And then finally, at least initially, in between all of the sessions, we provided like paper and pencil worksheets for people to practice the skills. And we would come to their bedsides every once in a while and check in with them to see which skill they wanted to practice. Now you can go to that next slide, Matthew. So we did a whole series of different kinds of studies to see, was this feasible? Did people like it? How did it work? How should we deliver it best? How do we measure it? How do we know that we're doing it consistently? And then ultimately we studied it in a big clinical trial where we found that compared to all of the usual psychosocial care that patients and families with cancer receive, if you added Prism to that care, patients reported higher senses of their own resilience, better quality of life, higher hope for their futures, a greater ability to find benefit and meaning from their experience, and lower psychological distress and a 90% reduction in the odds of their developing depression within the first 6 months of their cancer diagnosis. So we felt like it was a win. Yes. And I will just hand the baton to Matthew because what we noticed was the limitation was we weren't really speaking the language that these teens and young adults wanted us to. And so with huge gratitude to the Artefact team, we decided to expand our work and partner with them.
And when you guys first came to us, the discussion was, oh, we need an app. And of course, one of the things that we do in responsible design is to think very, very carefully about the right types of experiences, given the types of outcomes that we're trying to achieve. So oftentimes people very quickly go to the technology, like, oh, it needs to be an app or we need VR. And we always sort of question that. So when we first met, it's like, do you really need an app? But once we started getting into it, it became very, very clear that yes, for lots of reasons, this experience is not just really appropriate as a digital one, something that a person could experience on their mobile device, but it actually affords a new level of them to sort of build these skills in terms of being more resilient. So we had that initial sort of like question of really, but then once we dug in, it was very, very clear that this is just sort of a great application. So we were very excited. We came to that understanding very quickly, and then we were very excited to dig in and work with Abby and Joyce and the whole Prism team to develop what the app experience actually is. I don't want to dwell on it too much, but I just do want to show you a few sort of highlights of sort of the main architecture that you see here. You can see that the main menu structure follows a lot of the actual skills that Abby was just talking about. She talked through 4. We wanted to just break 2 apart so that they were just a little bit more accessible. So we ended up with 6 sort of core modules. One of the other things that we wanted to do, and this is with the goal of making sure that the Prism app experience would be able to get to scale, would be to not necessarily require an interventionalist or a clinician to be there working with the adolescent or young adult with serious illness, but to give them as much of an overview as they're onboarding into the experience about the value of this experience. So small clusters of the different types of modules and activities, and then a really brief introduction before they get into the app experience itself was one of the ways that we were trying to provide that orientation or that context to the users, to the community of use as they're actually getting into the app experience itself. The core part, though, is really about the idea of letting adolescents and young adults with serious illness be able to engage in this evidence-based, very successful intervention from Abby and Joyce, sort of on their own terms, very much meeting them where they are. The population spends so much time sort of in-app experiences. They are more free to do this sort of when and where they want to, late at night, as opposed to in a clinical environment. It's really about getting the tools to build that capacity in the hands of the people who need it most. So a few other things about getting it to scale was just sort of building off and adding a number of very small features or affordances. So for example, here you can see a pop-up menu that's just giving a little bit of indication around what this module is about, how long it would take, that it includes audio. Again, just giving little indications to the community of use of what they're going to be experiencing, so that they're able to use the device, or use the digital experience to their own and in the terms that they want it to be. Also smaller things like just having some smaller breakpoints in some of the modules that are a little bit longer. So for example, in writing SMART goals, it's a somewhat longer process. So we wanted to give moments of encouragement and appreciation to, again, keep that person moving forward with the benefit of the module. And also similarly in some of the evaluate your thoughts, providing a little bit more context there, and also some additional sort of indications or pathways so that they can basically see the return of the investment of their experiences as they're building this capacity. So for example, being able to view the progress as they're going through and using the different modules. Another part of the experience, which I think is really important, is just being able to see the connection between some of the skills that the community of use is building and sort of how it's impacting them, or how it's changing their lives, or creating a different kind of experience. So making really easy ways for people to sort of log on a scale how stressed they are feeling or how resilient they are feeling, and then being able to go back and actually look at that as a trend over time was another sort of key part of enabling or empowering the community of use to be able to build these skills as much as possible on their own at scale. Just a small detail in terms of just the visual design and the animation. We were very much trying to dial the visual design into what this age group and this community of use would appreciate, while at the same time trying to maintain an approachability, but also a seriousness to the design. Since this is people dealing with serious illness, too playful or too fun wouldn't be appropriate, but we still want it to be bright and engaging. So there's lots of very small animations and small design details that are all sort of in service of that goal. So that's just a high level of what the app experience is. Abby, can you just talk a little bit about sort of like what's the results of sort of people using the app so far? So do you have any data or just any initial indication from some of the studies or from some of the people who are using it? So where are you in terms of the process of understanding its impact?
Yeah, we're kind of right in the middle of the process. Okay. We've done a couple of things. As you guys know, Matthew, we started with an initial version of the app and tested it in a whole bunch of teens and young adults at our hospital, really just to understand better how people were engaging with the program. And we were tracking digital data to understand, is there one module that's better than another? Are people spending more time in one? How do we maintain that connectivity with them? Mm-hmm. And what was really interesting about those data were, not only were people really enthusiastic about the app as a way to sort of keep the program at their fingertips. They would say, well, the worksheets I might have forgotten in my bedroom, and I want to be able to work on it when I'm at school. The app was always with them in this era of so ubiquitous smartphone use. The other thing is, in intervention science, we wonder a lot about like which ingredient, for example, which Prism skill is the thing that matters. Mm. And what was remarkable about our digital data was that every single program was being used almost the same amount. And when we sort of tried to evaluate what seems to be people's favorite, there was no clear winner or loser. It seemed to me that for some people, each skill was really important, and for some maybe less so. And that sort of resonates because my philosophy is that people don't know what resilience resources they need until they learn them. And so rather than assuming, for example, that mindfulness is going to work for you, Matthew, what I want to do is say, here's a sort of a la carte experience for what resilience might look like. You pick what works for you, because that's the one that's the most likely to be successful. And so the digital data told us that. And then we came back to you with those things, and we built this new one, and now it's embedded in all of our projects. We're in the sort of, as you know, 3.0 build, and thinking even more about how to really engage and make this a user-friendly design. And I think it is doing nothing but strengthening our program exponentially.
Okay. Do you get the sense, you mentioned not wanting to sort of surface the 6 different modules and letting the person sort of decide which one is working for them the most. Is that something that's, just from sort of a capacity building perspective, is that okay if people just sort of gravitate to a certain few, or is it really the breadth or the combination of those different modules that has the impact?
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that. That's a really good question. And there are some really smart people in the world who are trying to break out the components of their intervention and answer that question. I worry a little bit that we always have this balance in trying to translate something from evidence-based science to what people will use. Mm. So if you had like a requirement for 16 sessions, people wouldn't do it. Mm. If you only propose one and it takes 10 minutes or 1 minute really to do the breathing, is that enough? What's the right dose? I don't actually think we know the answer to that yet. I really do, again, philosophically think we got lucky with hitting kind of a sweet spot with Prism. Nothing is too long. Some of them are really nice and short so that people can do them frequently, mm-hmm. and we'll be able to get a better sense. But I wouldn't take any of them away, because each of them is so important to patients as far as we can tell.
Great, awesome. So that's, again, and I want to leave enough time for questions. That was sort of a really deep focus dive into the app experience itself. If we can now sort of expand out and take like a much bigger look at sort of what's happening in the world right now with the number of stressors that are out there when you think about social unrest and financial collapse and systemic racism, COVID, right? It's like there's just a lot going on in 2020. So what are your thoughts just in general about Prism being used outside of this specific audience that was sort of the one that you were working with specifically?
Yeah, I'm so glad you asked that. I'm going to answer that after I say one thing, which is, you know, COVID and Black Lives Matter and a lot of the other things that we have witnessed in our I was going to say family and country, have really helped me and Joyce think about our own resilience theory in a novel way. And what we noticed this year was that the process of resilience seems to come in phases for people. It's not something you like turn on and off. It's not quite as simple as that teeter-totter that patients were describing. And so what we've now sort of conceptualized is that resilience has 3 parts. The first is what we call getting through. This is the like, holy moly, what is happening in the world? I just need to get out of bed today, and I can't manage the uncertainty, but I'm able to put food on my table and take a shower. You know, it's literally the like just living with a new adversity that feels really untenable to most people. But that is still part of being resilient, is that you got out of bed, ate, and took a shower.
Got it.
So that's number 1. Number 2 is when the work happens. That's the harnessing of resources. That's the descriptions that all of our work has shown. But people really have to be ready to do that work in order to build the skills. And then the skills building has to be deliberate, has to be regular. Just like if I wanted to ride a bike or learn how to play the violin, you can't just do it willy-nilly. You have to sort of do it with purpose and continue to practice. And then finally, the last part of resilience is when we human beings what Joyce and I call look back and learn. And this is like, holy cow, what just happened? Who am I now? What did I learn from that? Who will I be the next time something happens? And so I think that context, Matthew, is really important, because when you think about Black Lives Matter in particular, we need to do a whole lot of introspection in the looking back and learning and evaluating our own resilience as a society and thinking about how to continue to move forward, perhaps in a different way than we have for a very long time. And so I think that the resilience lens helps us to think about that in a constructive way. All that said, we have had a tremendous demand for things Prism-like in this year. And we have really rethought our initial philosophy that this was going to be something specific for kids and families facing serious pediatric illness because the demand became so great in our society. So we started, we adapted the program for something we call Prism at Work. And this is helping healthcare professionals, in particular those in the front lines in the COVID pandemic, to build their own resilience and maintain their sense of purpose during this very difficult time. So that program has now been funded and is launching here at Seattle Children's, and Joyce is leading that. We have two separate initiatives that are also ongoing. One is we have a person within our lab who believed, appropriately recognized that kids in schools, like younger kids, need help, especially now that they're all schooling from home, if schooling at all. And so we are now rolling out a Prism in Schools program. And then most recently, we had interest to roll out Prism for teachers. So not only the students, but also the teachers who are really stuck between, do I go back to work and do my duty as a teacher and an educator versus how do I balance the potential risk to myself? And that is really hard. And so we're supporting teachers as well.
Great. Awesome. Sounds like very exciting plans of even just taking what you know is working well and just spreading it out into the world for as much positive impact as possible. Can you just talk one more question, then I'm gonna see if the audience has anything to ask. I'm just curious if so we're talking a lot about sort of the tools and the research. If you were to paint this ideal picture of what being resilient looks like sort of in the future, what would that sort of like picture be? Is this just going to be something that's always going to be part of the human experience, or do you see a time where it becomes a core skill, much like breathing? Or I mean, just your thoughts on your ideal world.
Well, my ideal world is less than my realistic, cynical world. So
okay.
I might have two answers. So the thing about resilience is, if you think about it, human beings have been going through adversity like as long as we have existed. And in general, we figure it out and we get through tough times and we learn from them. Maybe history repeats itself and then we continue to make some hopefully preventable mistakes. But cynically, I think resilience is something we all inherently have the capacity to build, and we will continue to build it when we need it. I would love to see a more idealized world, and I hope that our work can start to move the needle a little bit in this to say, let's be a little forward thinking now and proactive. Let's bolster our resilience, buffer ourselves from these adversities, think more critically about how, for example, adversities are always going to be hard. They're always going to be stressful. Change is never not going to be difficult for people. And if we normalize how we can get through that hard, I think we will do better. And I think we as a society and as individuals will be a little bit more graceful within those moments of uncertainty.
Got it. Great. Awesome. Thank you for that answer. It was great. All right, so now I'm going to field some questions from the audience if you're up for it, Dr. Rosenberg. So we had a question from John Salzman, which is regarding fostering engagement with the app, to what extent, if at all, do we use push notifications in terms of sort of keeping people engaged with the experience? Any thoughts on just the idea of how much should the technology be pushing or nudging versus just sort of pure elements of the participant's choice?
Matthew, I would love your user experience expertise in that one. What do you think?
It's a good one. I think it's something that through the design process we talked about and we thought about. From my perspective, I worry that if there's actually more, it's a balance, right? Like lots of things in design. If there's actually the potential to get people turned off and to actually walk away from the experience if it feels a little bit too nudgy or pushy. So some of my experiences, for example, with Uber, is just very much like rate the driver, and it just feels a little bit just heavy that I always have to go through these steps. So I would fear or wonder about a similar thing happening with this population, specifically when the goal is to give them the empowerment, to give them the ability to decide how to build these skills on their own. It feels to me, that's my opinion, I would want to talk to the awesome design team who worked on this, that it's a little bit more of, there's risk in stepping too far in terms of getting that engagement. We focused more on the idea of building more self-guidedness into the app so that it's much easier for an adolescent or adult to use it in the way that they want, less that it needs to be coming more like top-down or more from the technology pushing towards it. Do you have any other thoughts?
Yeah, I do, and thank you, Dr. Salzman, for that question. We are actually trying to look at usage data as a surrogate for dose to answer the question that is sort of underlying yours, which is how much usage matters to really be able to know that people were engaged enough to develop the skills and improve their resilience. And so, you know, we can see within app usage, we can see how frequently people come back to each page or how long they spend on each page. And we can use those variables and apply them in models to see, did they actually influence people's either within app reporting of their stress and resilience or external validated patient reported outcomes about their distress, anxiety, depression, quality of life, resilience, hope, a whole bunch of other things that we measure. And so I think it's a really important point because there probably is a magical spot that is based on individual differences and preferences for how much they like to be bugged or not bugged. And whoa, sorry everybody, are you still there?
Yep, we can hear you.
Sorry, my phone and computer are attached. I do not disturb. Your apologies. Anyway, so all right, now I've totally lost my train of thought. But I think it's an important question about how we find that sweet spot.
Right, great. So I think we have time for one more question, and this is from Erica. And Erica writes, I'd love to hear more about the research methods and process used to develop the Prism app. So one of my lessons learned through this whole experience is just about aligning on vocabulary. So one of the first discussions I think, Abby, you and I had was about this idea of research. So I'm coming in like, oh, research from like a design research perspective. We're going to talk to, 4 people and get some, which is very different from the kind of research that you do, which is very, very, same word, very, very different things. And very quickly we kind of figured that out, and then we're able to align on sort of what the definition or how we talk about those things differently. Clinical research versus design research, let's say. Both valuable, just very, very different. So can you talk a little bit more from the clinical research perspective? What were some of the methods that you used in terms of understanding sort of the value or getting to sort of Prism specifically?
Yeah, it's such a good question. It was so fun to learn with you guys, Matthew, when we started the language differences of what you meant about research versus what we meant. I think to answer this particular question, we came in with really years of human subjects research experience within the hospital that started with we'll try this breathing thing. What do you think? Now, if we try this next thing, what do you think? And the way we designed Prism originally outside of the app follows this very lengthy but well-prescribed scientific process where you do iterative design with patients and you pilot the program, you get feedback. And what we did was we piloted it with 5 people, got feedback. Are we right? Are we not? How do we change it? 5 more people, change it, 5 more people, until we got to a point where people weren't suggesting much. And then we said, okay, this must be right. And then we developed a script and we developed something that we could reproduce, and we figured out ways that we could prove that the same thing was being delivered each time. And then we asked if that's feasible and what people think about it. And then we did one study where we looked at outcomes, and then we did a big, what's called a randomized clinical trial to do another outcome study. And now we have several multi-site national studies that are funded by the National Institutes of Health that are trying to answer this question on a broad scale. All of that, though, when we came to Matthew, we were like, we have no idea how to do this. Here's what we have. And we literally handed you guys this ream of paper stuff and asked you to figure out how to then turn it into something that honored what we knew scientifically worked and added to the whole experience. And that part, as you heard us talking about before, we're still newer in that whole process about learning, and we have figured out hybrid methods between Matthew's and my like ideas of research, where we're doing like user-centered design, and we have key stakeholders involved in like piloting the app and giving us feedback, and we continue to study these other things in this very different type of methodology.
And some of those studies that you were talking about, those are in terms of like months or years, correct?
Oh yeah, those are years. Like
yeah.
these like the studies that I talked about for the National Institutes of Health are 5 or 6 years long. So it's like 5 years from now, we'll know if we were able to do this in multiple sites amongst kids who are getting bone marrow transplants. Like it's like, it takes a very long time. And Matthew, you helped us crunch that time, and some of us acted in a way that was really nice.
To a really different end though. So some of our research might be more on the rapid iterative test and evaluation side of things, where it's sort of a sit down with a person who would be using the app to just have them go through tasks. That's more sort of on the design research thing. Again, Abby, your research is years, months. Mine is more like weeks, maybe. So just again, very, very different of value, but also doing things like not just sort of early in the design process, getting people to give input on it, but also once we have a working app, letting people use the app for a slightly longer period of time, and then to follow up with them and get more longitudinal-ish data about what that experience is like and how it changes over time. So awesome question from Erica. We are slightly over time, so I apologize for that. I do just want to give a final thank you to both Abby and also Joyce for just the partnership and the collaboration, and also for joining us at our little discussion here, our conversation. As always, it's just awesome to work with you guys, and I learn something from you all every time we interact, so thank you for that.
Thanks. Thanks for having us today, Matthew. And ditto, we are so grateful for this relationship and partnership with you all. It has strengthened every piece of our work, so thank you.
One thing I do want to show is for contact information, you can get in touch with Dr. Rosenberg. Here's her Twitter handle, and then my email is on the bottom of the slide as well. So that's it. Thank you very much, everyone, for attending. Thank you.